Power move. Guess not, huh? Yeah, sorry. It's early in the morning. Gotta get that out there. There we go.
Power Moves for the Super Nintendo Entertainment System. Released in 1993 courtesy of Kaneko and also available on the Sega Genesis under the name Deadly Moves. This is a one-on-one fighting game where you control the fighter known as Joe and must defeat other fighters from all over the world to challenge the final boss Ranker. And that's about it, really. There's a two-player versus mode where you and a buddy can pit the various fighters against each other, but if you're playing solo, you're only playing Joe. And that's a bit of a shame cause who gives a shit about some Joe named Joe? I want to be the great bald guy or the guy with suspenders. I'll take the game's single solitary female character over some guy named Joe. The fact that the game's story allows you to pick the opponent you wish to fight as opposed to the fighter you want to actually control just adds salt to the single player's wound. Now I do like that whenever you beat a fighter, you get some stat boosts, in theory making yourself a little stronger than before. Also, this game has passwords so you can continue where you left off in a prior story mode game. These are rather novel features that would later be copied by another fighter called Doomsday Warrior, also on the SNES, a subject matter of a previous video review. So now that I've padded the video with some worthless information, let's touch on the gameplay, which is rather fascinating to say the least. And by fascinating I mean, well, we'll see. Power Moves, also known as Deadly Moves, also known as Power Athlete in foreign territories, is a one-on-one fighting game where the goal, naturally, is to beat your opponent in a traditional best of 3 rounds format. Each of the game's 8 fighters and 1 boss has a couple basic attacks, punch, kick, aerial strikes, and a couple throws at their disposal, as well as 2 special moves, the supposed power moves of the game. As you would expect, command for these moves vary between fighters, but they're relatively simple fare. You just hold the direction on the D-pad and press both punch and kick buttons to execute the attack. Some attacks can be performed in a charged fashion similar to how one would execute a sonic boom in Street Fighter, and I assure you that's the most complex move execution you'll find in Power Moves. There are no quarter circle motions or Shoryuken style motion commands. Executing the specials are dirt easy to pull off, so long as you know the commands of course. In addition to having a punch button and a kick button, Power Moves also has a jump button, which is a normally awkward proposition for a 2D fighting game, and I know this from experience I'm afraid, but in this case its inclusion makes sense. See, in Power Moves, fighters can not only move left or right but also up or down in limited fashion, which is rather useful for sidestepping attacks and projectiles, and this is done of course by pressing up or down on the D-pad. Therefore, a jump button is necessary because without it you can't jump. Of course, because of this moving up and down business, you can't exactly duck either, which is a bit of a shame, but at least you could block attacks the same way you block in most fighting games, so it's not a total loss. Control works well enough, the buttons are somewhat responsive, pulling off moves is pretty simple and relatively hassle-free, though to say it's picture-perfect response is a bit of a stretch, but hey, it works most of the time. Collision tends to be a finicky matter due to the vertical inclination of character motion, usually boiling down to timing an attack that misses because you are an inch too high or something, and sometimes being so close to an enemy that your blows will whiff, but it's not completely problematic, and it works well enough, most of the time. If anything, my biggest issue was trying to pull off throws as it seems somewhat selective at times, but I've rarely used for them anyway. Trying to figure out the best use of these power move things proved the wiser strategy. And I suppose if there is a major complaint to be had with power moves, it's just a rather bland feeling I have in regards to gameplay overall. Oh, there's a couple neat ideas like the stat building in the single player and the password system to continue your progress down the line, but at the same time restricting the single player mode to just one character is disappointing, especially when the other fighters seem somewhat more interesting to play with. And while these fighters are playable in the game's 2-player mode, finding the second player to play this game with you might be the bigger challenge. The fighting could have benefited from perhaps a touch more speed to make it feel a little more intense. Even ancient side-scrolling beat-em-ups like Renegade or Double Dragon felt a bit quicker than Power Moves. Still, being bland doesn't make the game bad, just uninteresting, and at the very least Power Moves is fairly playable on a whole, there just isn't a whole lot to it. The stages in Power Moves are actually quite nice. Mind you, they're your typical battle settings you find in most fighting games, the temple stage, the lift stage, the arena stage, nothing out of the ordinary, but the way the background moves and the way the perspective shifts depending on the position of the camera, for lack of a better term, is pretty impressive. It's a relatively minor detail, but one that catches your eye if you pay attention. I suppose the best example of this would be the temple stage. Look at that perspective, absolutely amazing. As for the rest of the game, it looks fine. The characters are somewhat large and detailed, but not by much. Animation is not much to go on. The mugshots are typical SNES mugshots. It's an alright looking game, if not a bit bland, but those backgrounds, it's a nice little thing. Sound in Power Moves also continues the rather bland theme of the day. There are some voice bites for move calls, grunts, and things of that nature, and they're fairly clean sounding. Sound effects are your typical stock punchy, kicky, hitting, fighting sounds, and they sound a bit on the weak side, almost lacking a bit of punch, no pun intended. The music isn't too bad, nothing amazing, but it is upbeat, it's thematic, it's adequate, it's fine. That's it. Nothing really sticks out in that regard. Overall, Power Moves on the Super NES is a somewhat mediocre fighting game, not bad enough to be considered worthless or unplayable because it isn't, but just not good enough to be enjoyed for any prolonged period of time. While the sidestepping and stat building features are quite novel for its day, the core gameplay just feels a bit bland on a whole, regardless of whether you're only playing as one guy in single player, or can somehow manage a buddy to play the whole shebang in two-player mode. Still, for what it's worth, Power Moves is perhaps one of the better third-rate fighters on the SNES that I've played thus far, with a couple neat ideas and some impressive perspective work on the backgrounds. If nothing else, it somewhat exceeded my admittedly non-existent expectations to gain some measure of entertainment, but not much more than that. If you want something different and cheap and don't mind a somewhat shallow experience, Power Moves might be worth a look. It's not great, but it's mostly harmless.